Hello and welcome to WION. I'm Giles Gibson. Tonight we discuss the Indian Army's newly appointed chief, Lieutenant General Bipin Rawat. Breaking with tradition, the Modi government chose Rawat, the Vice Chief of the Army Staff, over two more senior colleagues. But the opposition are now accusing the government of steamrollering the custom of appointing on seniority. Before we discuss that decision and the role of military chiefs in other parts of the world with our live guests, let's first take a look at the reaction inside India.
India's million-man army has a new chief, Lieutenant General Bipin Rawat, currently Vice Chief in Delhi. He takes over in the new year from Dalbir Suhag.
There's no doubt merit comes first, but at the level that we are talking about, that's the level of a chief. The seniority is a small issue because all the top lieutenant generals, 6 army commanders and 1 vice chief, they would generally be within a small range of seniority. And when they've reached that level of army commanders and the vice chief, they're all highly competent.
General Rawat is expected to bring fresh thinking on the current situation along the line of control. More important reports suggest his appointment is linked to ambitious plans to reorganize the army. The idea is to cut flab, bring greater efficiency and enhance operational readiness. It could also include a greater say for the political executive in the appointment of the 6 army commanders. Critics say the seniority principle has sometimes led to senior officers playing it safe, refusing to take operational risks with the knowledge that a clean record could ease their rise to the top. Though political parties in India are fighting over the issue of merit and seniority, the appointment issue also has another dimension, and that being priority which infantry is getting within the armed system. Many in army feel that it also shows that infantry gets the largest share of command postings than armoured or artillery divisions. Kartikeya Sharma for WION.
Right now, to get more reaction to this appointment within India, I'm joined by Major General Ashok Mehta, who's a defence expert, as well as Sudhi Ranjan Sen, the Deputy Editor of News at Huffington Post India. And also to get some of the international reaction and how military chiefs are, how their role plays out in other countries, I'm joined by Glenn Carl, who's a writer and former intelligence officer from Washington, DC, and Mandy Clark, WION's London Bureau Chief. I want to go to you first, Major General Mehta in Delhi. This tradition of appointing on seniority within the Indian Army, what's that designed to do exactly?
Well, firstly, this principle of seniority is not cast in stone. Remember one thing, that when the chief is selected, if it were purely by seniority, then why would the appointment committee of the cabinet call for the dossiers of all the 6 army commanders plus the RTRAC commander? In other words, they are looking at the dossiers of 7 gentlemen who have reached the highest position in the army. So the question is simple, that there is the political prerogative that the government can exercise if it chooses to. The fact that it hasn't done so for the years doesn't mean that that option is not available. So that's the first point. Because if it was simply a matter of seniority, then you just send the dossier of the senior-most man and his name will be announced.
Right, but Major General, if I can interrupt you there, clearly there is a tradition. It's not completely necessary, but there is a tradition, a decades-old tradition of appointing on seniority. I'm just wondering, from your point of view as a military man, what is that tradition actually designed to do exactly?
Is that for me?
Yes, Major General, yeah.
Yeah, you see, the army has customs. They say the navy has traditions, and the air force has habits. But this particular example that you are quoting about the army having this convention, I would rather say that it's a convention, not a rule, that the senior most gets promoted. In the past, this convention has been broken in 1983 when the government felt it was necessary. It did do that.
Right.
Now, for whatever reasons, the question is that the Chief of Army Staff is a choice that is made by the political executive. It's not done by an army. All other promotions in the military system are done either by army, military, or air force boards. There is one appointment alone that is done by the political executive. And therefore, that political choice, in spite of the army rule or convention or what you call the tradition, is not cast in stone. And therefore, the Appointments Committee of the Cabinet has the option.
All right, Major General, I'm going to have to cut you off there. That's not at dispute. What I'm trying to get at here, and I'll bring in Sudhi Ranjan Sen, the Deputy Editor of News from Huffington Post India at this point. Mr. Sen, do you think that this tradition, of course we've established that it's not a rule, do you think this tradition is designed to keep political interference out of the military? What do you think this tradition is designed to do?
As the General was explaining, it's not a rule, it's not a statutory requirement, but it's a convention. But that said, the convention has come up to limit political interference both ways. There should not be political interference from the executive, so to say, in deciding who is the next chief. Mind you, the Indian Army is completely apolitical, and it has been a boon for this country. Unlike what we see has happened in Pakistan, it is because the Indian Army was and is apolitical that democracy has flowered and flourished here. And this is the reason why perhaps this convention was brought in. But that said, the decision of the government, it's right in the sense because it is the prerogative of the government, so to say, to decide who's the next chief. And in the past there have been examples, although not very, very common, but it is also not unheard of when seniority has been bypassed. Chaz.
Right, and I want to bring in Glenn Carl at this point in Washington, D.C. for us. Mr. Carl, is this similar in the United States? Is the head of the military, the head of the army specifically here, given such a prominent role in public life, or is this sort of a bit of a surprise for you?
Who's actually the head of the military and controls about a quarter of the government's budget, which is, in our case, $600 billion of some amount. It's an absolutely critical function. It decides a lot about employment based on his decisions, as well as matters of life and death, of course, and the fate of the nation. On the seniority point, I think that goes back probably to the Romans. It certainly goes back, in our case, to the English and the French. And it's a way of organizing the military. The military leadership is all about command. And if you have two officers of equal rank, who find themselves in a critical moment in combat, say, or even if not, who have to assume command because their superior is no longer able to, how do you make that decision on the spot? And it's done by seniority. Now, it's not written in stone, as the gentleman spoke first said, because there are political reasons and substantive reasons that our civilian commanders may decide that Mr. Carl is superior to Mr. Smith, or Mr. Smith is superior to Mr. Carl, and then they choose. General Eisenhower, I think, was junior to several dozen officers in 1941, but was chosen by the civilian leadership to command the Allied forces in World War II because they recognized his merit. So both tradition, hierarchy, seniority and then political free will to choose the leader are useful things, and that's why it shakes out that way.
And Mandy, I want to bring in you from London. Can you give us a sense of how the Defence Chief of Staff is selected there? Is it a similar process to the Indian process?
Is selected more similarly to the American process, where it is the government of the day that decides the Chief of Defense. Now, the Queen technically is the Commander-in-Chief, but very much she's a figurehead. She tends to rubber stamp the decision that the government of the day decides upon. However, Britain traditionally used to decide on seniority, and it was only 30 years ago that they really kind of broke with that tradition themselves and just had the government decide that they'll always be kind of one of the top commanders in the armed forces, but it won't necessarily be the most senior. But that change only happened 40 years ago.
Sean, I want to go back to Major General Ashok Mehta in Delhi for us. Major General, the supporters of this appointment will say that the government should be free to appoint whoever they want based on merit. Would you agree with that statement? I think we've lost Major General Mehta, so I'll put the same question to Sudhi Ranjan Sen, the Deputy Editor of News at the Huffington Post, India. And we've also lost him as well. So I'll go back to Mr. Carl in Washington, D.C. We've actually seen recently a bit of a sort of reaction about James Mattis, the new Defense Secretary, in this opening up of that debate about the tradition within the United States of civilians being in charge of the military. Do you think that's at risk of being blurred with this appointment of Mattis only a few years out of the military?
Yes. Well, I think that General Mattis has extraordinary qualities. He's, I think, one of the only two, possibly three, appointments in the Trump administration to be that I find competent. But your specific question on the importance of having civilian control of the military in my career, the intelligence service, is very important. It was recognized at the beginning, the creation of the CIA and the creation of the United States, that civilian leadership must be primordial. That is being frittered away progressively. It has been over the last 30 years anyway, during my career. And it is something of conscious, open concern among my colleagues in the intelligence community that we have military officers who come from a different tradition. It's a fine one, but it's a different. You don't have worker bees be warriors and warriors be worker bees and so on. It's a different concept and mission. And now we find this in this instance with the Defense Department. So whatever his qualities, it does raise issues that are of concern, yes.
And is it designed to keep those sort of balance those perspectives out, not have ex-military men managing the military who are perhaps going to line up on a similar line of on any particular issue? Is that what it's designed to do?
Well, in part, but it's even more broad than that, because of course, the only in any functioning state, the only entity that may have the legitimate use of force is the government itself. The police power must be a monopoly of the state. And who has the weapons, who has the power, therefore, it is the military. And if the military is not under civilian control theoretically, and one hopes, representing the will of the people rather than a military establishment, then you have a grave problem threatening democracy. So one step you take to avoid the crisis of ancient Rome, where the Praetorian Guard decided who was the emperor, is to have civilian control of the military, of the legitimate use of force. If you erode this concept, however great the qualities of the uniformed or formal uniformed person, then you're undermining, one fears, one of the principles of democracy.
And Mandy, is it the same principle in the UK as the Defence Secretary? Is it so insistent that they're a civilian rather than an ex-military man or woman?
Well, the Secretary of Defense will work. The Defense Minister works hand in hand with the chief of defense, and so that one guy, chief of defense, is your senior military officer. He works hand in hand with the defense secretary, who's civilian. They make decisions together. They look at the threats that face Britain, but it is imperative that the person that is chosen is by the civilian government, and that they're working hand in hand with the civilian government to prevent, obviously, concerns about coup, and for the military to go for the will of the elected people. I think it's very in lockstep with the states in that viewpoint.
So, Glenn Carl in Washington, D.C. for us, do you think this sort of balance between the military and the civilian and how it's viewed is essentially born from the kind of the experience of the political history within a given country?
Oh, certainly. Political culture is everything. I mean, the laws only have life if they are ingrained, part of the DNA of the social mores of the society itself. So, yes, civilian control of the government is given lip service, at least, to everyone, but it only has life in a society that has an organically rich civil society and political culture. And these things don't change overnight. Revolutions always fail because they try to make instantaneous changes. They change organically and progressively. So when you have a military leader appointed to the intelligence community, and then a military person appointed to the head of the Defense Department or the military, and et cetera, you start changing the unconscious norms of the electorate, and they come to accept things, or even if they don't, the power structure has shifted a little bit. So that's why, quite explicitly, the founding fathers of the United States 240 years ago now tried to design a system to protect against that kind of erosion of the civil society and the effective civilian popular control of the government. It's a never-ending dynamic, but it can always be undermined or it can be strengthened. In this instance, I have high regard for General Mattis, but it is continuing another step in a disturbing trend for me.
Right, a never-ending dynamic, and we've got lots more to discuss. We're going to take a quick break, but we'll be joined by both my guests and hopefully a couple more when we come back after a short break. Welcome back. We're continuing our discussion, teed off by the appointment of the new Indian military chief, Lieutenant General Bipin Rawat. And we're still joined by Mandy Clark, WION's London bureau chief, as well as Glenn Carl, an American writer and ex-intelligence officer in Washington, D.C. I want to continue with you, Glenn, about the appointment of James Mattis. How is that appointment settling down? It's been a few days now since we've heard about that. He's obviously made some pretty controversial comments in the past. What's the sort of media angle on him now, a few days after the announcement?
Yes, well, everyone's eyes and attention and our ears always follow a glittering object or a crinkly sound. And so the media, and I'm not disparaging the media simply sort of represents our senses in this instance, follows the apparently notable quotations that General Mattis has uttered over the course of his career. I think that's misleading, actually. When you look at his career, he's an exceptionally talented officer. Now, he may not be the most original thinker, but he is a true thinker, which is something good and frighteningly highly unusual in the Trump cabinet in the making. So, as I've said on a previous program with you, and many others have said elsewhere, Mattis appears to be possibly the star or the most qualified individual in the future Trump administration. How that will play out, he is a traditionalist, I guess you could say, with respect to our policies towards Iran, meaning that he's quite hostile. The framework since 1979 is that the default assumption is that Iran is a revolutionary and an expansionist power, therefore destabilizing the Middle East, therefore threatening international stability and American interests, and therefore to be challenged. That has come under some revision or at least questioning in the past 8 years under the Obama administration. Another point is that the traditional American position has de facto and even explicitly allied with the Sunni in the Middle East as opposed to the Shia in Islam. There's a Sunni-Shia clash ongoing in Syria between Saudi Arabia and Iran and so on. And Mattis accepts that traditional perspective also, which again, for the past 8 years, has been somewhat revised. A strategic shift has been underway by the United States. Mattis rejects those two positions and has stated that he's quite hostile to Iran, which is in line with American policy for 30 years. So I think you'll have competence, but the not novel thinking, and that's not a criticism, that's just an observation.
Right.
The comments about Mattis within the framework of the administration shaping up, those have largely died away. And it's worth saying, unfortunately, part of the reason that there's no comment on Mattis much now is because there's a crisis and a crazy thing that happens every 20 minutes almost. Every day there's some highly unusual, precedent-breaking ignoring of tradition and American policy in the context of international relations for the last 70 years. It's just shocking what's happening here.
All right, I'm afraid that's all we've got time for, but thank you to my guests from India earlier, Major General Ashok Mehta and Sudhi Ranjan Sen from the Huffington Post India, as well as Mandy Clark, WION's correspondent in London, and Glenn Carl, the writer and former intelligence officer from Washington, D.C. Thank you all for your input, and that's all we've got time for this evening. But news and updates continue on the other side of a very quick break.